I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Folks, we're building another quadcopter today, and I'm super excited about the parts that we've selected. So, if you are at all interested in the new Stingersswarm Freestyle frame from X-Hover, if you are interested in, as somebody who has a motor with my name on it, I hesitate a little bit to say this, but these are some of the best motors that you can get for the money, no question. The Xing motors and T-Motor F55A ESC. This is my new, at any cost, if you need an absolutely bulletproof top-of-the-line ESC, this is the one that I'm currently recommending until people start telling me it's failing on them, and then I'll move on to the next one. And the SPRacing H7 flight controller from Mr. Clean Flight, Dominic Clifton, the guy who originally invented Clean Flight. He still makes flight controllers. Each of these has something interesting about it that makes it unique and made me pick it for this build. So come along with the build and come along as we talk about what makes all this stuff unique. We'll start with the frame, which is the Stingersswarm frame. And the thing that makes this frame stand out, other than the fact that it was designed by Mr. Stingersswarm and built by X-Hover, who makes pretty decent frames, what makes it stand out is that it was made with forged carbon. And when I heard about that, I had to look up what forged carbon was. And forged carbon, so if you imagine regular carbon fiber as being a bunch of long, thin strands of carbon fiber, like think about like spaghetti noodles. They're long, thin strands of carbon fiber, and they are laid in sheets, and they are impregnated with like an epoxy resin that then hardens, and you end up with sheets of carbon fiber. And the orientation of these strand layers actually has a lot to do with the characteristics. You can change the characteristics of the carbon fiber in terms of its strength, its toughness, and so forth, based on how you lay out those strands. But the problem is that if you need to make an irregular surface, right, it actually is pretty time-consuming to do. And the way that it's done is they take a mold, and they, while the carbon fibers are not yet impregnated and hardened, that didn't come out right. They lay the carbon fibers over the mold, they bake the mold to harden it, and that takes a lot of time. Whereas just taking sheets of carbon fiber, you can just crank those suckers out. Well, what forged carbon is basically just chopped up bits of carbon fibers. So instead of like long spaghetti strands, chopped up bits. And what they can do with this is sort of squeeze it into a mold, right? It's kind of like injection molded carbon fiber, I guess. They squeeze it into a mold, they put the resin in, the resin hardens, and forged carbon is very good for making irregular shaped objects. One of the things that they make out of forged carbon is golf club heads. Very light, strong golf club heads. And you could think about the irregular shape of a golf club head. But here's the thing about forged carbon. It is definitively weaker than regular sheet carbon because the carbon fiber strands are chopped up into bits instead of being in individual strands. It's weaker. So it's good for making irregular shapes, but weaker. So then why would you make a quadcopter out of it? What were you thinking, X-Hover? Well, actually, that was my first thought. And it turns out that the main thing that's cool about forged carbon is that it looks freaking awesome. I think this is really probably what attracted X-Hover and Stingy to this. And they actually released a frame made of 100% forged carbon, and it was weak and it broke. And that's why if you heard about the Stingy forged carbon frame months ago and then you were like, where was it? That's what happened. They were like, we can't sell it if it's going to be weak. But here's the thing. People they were like, I don't care that it's weak. I just want this awesome looking forged carbon. So here's what they've done with this. The inner layers of the carbon are Toray 700 super strong normal carbon fiber. Just top quality normal. I don't know what Toray 700 is, but people seem very, very impressed with Toray 700 carbon fiber. This is normal carbon fiber, and then there's just this one outer sort of cosmetic layer of forged carbon to look awesome. So, best of both worlds. As far as the rest of the frame goes, there's not a lot that's like revolutionary about the design. It's a pretty typical top plate, bottom plate. It's a low deck design, so we have short standoffs here to keep the center of gravity centralized. Looks like 2.5 or 3 millimeter carbon fiber for the plates. That's good. That'll add some durability. And we've got removable arms here, so individual arms can be swapped out. We've got a reinforcing X plate on the bottom so that when the arms take stress, it's sandwiched, and that makes it a little stronger. Do the arms lock together? Well, I got to take all of these freaking screws out just to find out. Can I just take 2 screws out and take an arm out? 1, 2. Is that it? The arms just should come out, right? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so you can see here the arms have a beveled shape that locks together to help prevent them from sort of camming out under stress. That's a good thing. And I guess we just demonstrated that you can easily change an arm with just taking 2 screws out. No problem. It does look like you would need to take out the stack screw as well. Yeah, that might get in the way. Well, anyway, no big deal. One of the things that's different about this version of the frame is that it is sized only for micro cameras. The original Stingersswarm frame had a cutout. It was kind of a novel design. It had a cutout and a little chin here where the full-size camera would actually drop down through the bottom plate, and that let you have a full-size camera along with a low-deck design. Micro cameras these days have just as good image quality and use the exact same lenses as full-size cameras. There's the same sensors, the same lenses, it's just a smaller form factor, so there's no reason not to just commit to a micro camera at this point, and there's nothing wrong with the fact that this frame has done that. The motors we're going to go with are the iFlight Xing, Xing, I'm going to say Xing. I hope that's correct. They're the iFlight Xing motors, and I don't know who is iFlight and where did they come from, but they have been making really, really excellent motors for a little while now, and I'm very glad to finally get a chance to feature them on one of my builds. Now, they stand out as awesome looking, which I know we're all supposed to be super technical nerds who care only about performance, but we're not, are we? They look awesome, and in fact, they actually come in really cool camo patterns. I've gone for the more subdued black and green, but they come in really awesome camo patterns. They have a really cool spoked pattern on the bell, and I met these guys at International Open, and one of them was like, I think we're going to use a different pattern on our second generation of motors. And I was like, no, this is like the Nike swoosh and the Coca-Cola bottle shape. This is so distinct. I see these spokes and I'm like, oh, that's a Xing motor. So I hope that they keep the same pattern. I think it looks awesome. And frankly, I think it has a lot of strength by just having a lot of spokes around the edge. It means that there's a less unsupported length of the bell, and I think it makes them stronger. Another thing that contributes to the strength of these motors is that they have a curved bell. Now, this is a relatively tall bell. This is a 2208 motor, and the curve is a little bit less pronounced than on some of the smaller motors, but I feel like not having a sharp edge right here, I think that, you come down and if there's a sharp edge, boom, and it gets gouged in, then the motor's just out of balance. I think that by having a rounded bell and a smooth edge there, it feels to me like that increases the durability. It ought to increase the durability, shouldn't it? I have to comment that Carreria was, I believe, the first to market with a curved bell in their TOA motor line, and I know that they have expressed some annoyance at people who came after them who also have curved motors. I'm not going to get into the debate of whether this is a clone or a copy or whether it's just someone going, oh, that's a good idea. But I feel like I owe it to Carreria to at least point that out. What I always do before I do a build is I'm just going to check, oh, no, that's a little tight. Just check the length of the screw. We want to see the screw extend about 1.5 to 2 millimeters above the plate, and I'm just going to hold this base up next to it and check and see whether the screw would go through the base and extend up above the base, and I can see that it won't. That's good. That's exactly what I want to see. You can't assume that the screws that came with your motors are the right length for your base plate thickness of your quadcopter. They come with different thicknesses of plate, so the manufacturer will have made some assumption about what size of base plate you're using, and if that turns out to be wrong, the screw could be too short or too long. Now, some people like to use a little bit of a longer screw because they feel like having it stick up further through the plate is more secure. But if you think about it, at any given point you have exactly the same number of threads engaged, regardless of whether there's an extra 3 millimeters of screw sticking out the other side of the base plate. Stingy frame comes with a 16x16 bolt pattern only. Some older motors may have only a 16x19 bolt pattern, which is what used to be used with plain motors. Quadcopter motors have mostly been switching to 16x16. If you had a 16x16 motor, you would only be able to use 2 screws at a time. I was worried for a minute that this might not have a 16x16 base on the motor, but it does, so that's good. My point is that at any given time, you'll only have so many threads of the screw and the motor base engaged with each other, no matter how long the screw is. So having additional screw length sticking up above here doesn't really buy you anything. If we look, I'm not going to be able to capture this on camera. These screws are just a little too short. We got maybe a 0.5 millimeter where they're sunk down into the base. I'm going to tighten them up, and I'm just going to move on. Might want to use Loctite, or you might want to use a screw that's a tiny bit longer, but we definitely don't want the screws protruding up through the base plate because they can make contact with the motor windings and really screw things up. Just a little tip for you if you're ever working with a quad, and the problem with motor screws is that you can get a 6 millimeter, you can get an 8 millimeter, but if you need a 7 millimeter, it's going to be pretty difficult to find. What you can do is you can use the next longest length of screw and then just get some M3 washers. And if you just put a little M3 washer on there, they're about a 0.5 millimeter thick each. And that can just put the washers down here on the bottom, and that can make up the difference. After installing the motors, the next thing I'm going to do is dress the wires with my signature red electrical tape. What I'd like to do is run the wires to the inside of the arm. That's assuming we're doing standard prop direction. If you're doing reverse prop direction, you'd run them to the outside. Basically, the gist of it is that if a prop gets bent down and strikes the arm, you don't want it to strike the wires. By running the wires just on the inside of the arm like this, the prop is less likely to hit them. And I like to dress the wires. I haven't done this on previous builds, but I'm going to try it on this build in hopes that having the wires dressed before I solder up the ESC will make me less likely to get the length of wires wrong. Sometimes you get the wire length wrong, and then the wires are too short. If they're too long, it's not such a bad deal, but if they're too long, it's not good. I'm just going to hold these in place. What I don't want to do when I'm snugging up the tape is pull the wires to the top of the arm. I want them resting on the front edge of the arm so they're out of the way of the props. Yeah, that's not bad. Next, the ESC. And the ESC we're going to use for this build is the T-Motor F55A. And the reason I'm using this is because people are always asking me, what is an ESC that will not freaking die on me? And it's harder to answer than you think. You can't just find an ESC with a 60 amp rating because, like, if the FETs are not well filtered or they're not up to spec, they'll pop just from, like, running on 6S or just too many factors to account for. So I've always got my ear to the ground for just a super, super premium ESC that I have never heard anybody say anything bad about. And if you go back in time, you've heard me recommend other ESCs. And I keep doing that until, well, I'm not going to name names, but eventually somebody's like, oh, there's a bad batch. And I'm just hearing from people, oh, yeah, I popped this ESC. And then I'm like, okay, well, you're fired. And currently, the ESC that I'm recommending that has not yet let me down, keep it up, T-Motor, is the T-Motor F55A. Now, this is a freaking expensive ESC. It's a beast of an ESC. It is not the ESC for every build. It is definitely not the ESC for a budget build. There are many other ESCs out there, as little as maybe $50 or $60 for a 4-in-1 they're fine. They're fine ESCs. But if you want one that is just as bulletproof as it could possibly be. This is the one I'm currently recommending. And oh, by the way, very nice. It does come with, oh, that's always good. I mean, this is a $3 part right here, so you can knock that off. Now this ESC comes with a lot of accessories, but what it doesn't come with is the standoffs or anything like that you need. So what I'm going to recommend, if you haven't already done this, is you get some of these assortments. This here is a cap head M3 assortment in various sizes. I also have a, this is a standoff assortment, nylon standoffs. Those are female standoffs. And these are the male to female standoffs with the, anyway, you don't need me to spell it out for you. And I also have an M3 button head assortment. Links to all of that down in the video description. You'll spend about $10 a piece on one of these, maybe a little less depending on what you're getting, maybe a little more, but it's well worth having one of these for all the sort of common hardware, so that when you're doing a build and you haven't got the length of screw that you want, then you will have the length of screw that you want. The one exception that I would make is for something like motor screws. Like, you just go through so many of these, you go through 16 of these per build, that I would suggest that you consider maybe just buying a pack of 50 or 100 if you know what length bottom plate you want. Buying in the assortments is actually a little more wasteful, because you'll just use all of those screws out of one assortment on like 1 or 2 builds. Now the question that always comes up is, how are you going to do your flight control stack? And there's 2 ways of doing it. One is with a long screw that goes all the way up through the stack, and one is with a short screw that goes into the bottom of the stack, and then it's sort of cascaded spacers. I'm going to try to do this one with a long screw that goes all the way up through the stack. It is stronger, but it also is more likely to damage the electronics. Actually, this guy isn't soft mounted. This guy doesn't have gummies or soft mounts. The problem with that is that if it's taken a lot of hits, it can be more likely to break. See, that's not long enough to then also put a board on there. So we have to go with the next longest screw. Make sure we have enough clearance on the bottom as well. Oh, see, that's not going to be enough clearance. It's going to touch. Some of this stuff is going to touch. So actually, we're going to need a longer standoff. So I have been using just a screw that gives, I think it's about 1.5 millimeters of clearance, but instead we're going to use one of these little, I guess it might be 2 millimeter standoffs. I'm not 100% sure. Let's see, because we need enough spacing there to make sure that the ESC is not touching. Well, see, that's enough spacing, but now I think we're not going to have enough room to put the flight controller on top. It looks like a lot of wasted space there. See, that's way more space than we really need. We need something in between. Need like 1.5 millimeters spacer. Yikes. How's the spacing if I use 2 nuts? I think that's a little less than 1 standoff. Yeah. That's what we're going to do. You just gotta, this is why it's good to have a kit, because you just got to kind of fiddle with it until you find the one that works the best. It is a little annoying that the standoffs especially don't come in like less than 1 millimeter lengths. In other words, if they can get a 2 and a 4, why can't I get a 3? What if I just put a washer? Might be 2 washers. You know what? 2 washers would definitely be enough spacing. Okay. See, I'm trying to get the ESC as low to the deck as possible so I don't waste any standoff height and squeeze the flight controller up against the top of the deck. Some of you are going to be concerned that I'm using metal screws, metal washers, and metal nuts for my standoff. You're going to wonder if that's going to like cause electricity to go where it shouldn't go, destroy something. It should not. The ESC, the mounting holes on the ESC should never be energized. So it should always be safe to use metal screws. There are a few very rare exceptions. One of them is like the TVS Power Cube stack, which intentionally uses the mounting holes to carry electricity, and that's documented. There's I think there's a Racer Star ESC that does it. It shouldn't, but it does. This is a 20 millimeter. So my bad. These are 20mm ESC, or a flight controller. If you're going to use a micro-sized flight controller, that's too bad. I guess, does Stingy use micros? I don't know. I'll have to ask him what he uses. So the workaround, of course, is going to be to remove this screw from the arm and just pass it up through this press nut and use that as my mounting hole. It does mean that if I need to change an arm, I will have to take the screw out of the bottom of the flight control stack. That's not the end of the world. It does mean, though, that we definitely don't want to pass our mounting screw all the way up through the stack, or we'll end up in a situation where we have to take the whole flight stack apart to change an arm. Alrighty, take all this out, do it again.